Was the music synced, or are they free floating and they can just kind of overlap at whim?
There's definitely some elements that are synced going from that environment to the other environment. The main backing is sort of like a string quartet that overlays between the two of them. And in the earlier part, there's like a piano piece that's in a major scale. And as you descend down, there's these sort of interlocking mallet percussion sections that come in more pentatonic scale that as you're going between the two of them, you can feel like they're interlocked rhythmically, but they're not really. The piano playing is so abstract, and then the string quartet, it does not have like a really defined pulse to it. So it's all sort of meant to sound as if it could go together, but it's not technically interlocking. But all those rhythmic mallet sections are interlocking. So there's sort of like little pools of things that interlocked that overlap with pools of things that don't. They sort of all sound natural together.
So yeah, like the first part is synced together and the second part is synced together, but the buffer between them, since it was like less rhythmic, we didn't need it to be synced. But I think the further you go into the bike ride, the more there is different percussions. Like I think in the tunnel, there's a different percussion than then when we're in the sort of post office, I guess. So yeah, those parts do have to be synced together.
There's one tricky aspect, which was that there's a state when it's time to sort of leave the main area. So nightfall has happened, you sort of imply that it's time for you to move on. And when that happens, there's another sort of musical theme that comes in, which is rhythmic, which meant that we had to make sure that we killed all the other environmentally placed musical cues that had rhythms in them so that there wasn't any sort of clash, because it would have been a little too complicated to tempo sync everything. So yeah, we had to come up with a system for that.
Night has fallen. The doors to the shrine must be open now.
So that's fantastic. Transitioning between these sections, are they trigger volumes? Like, how do you know when you're leaving one and entering another? What was the behind the scenes on that?
As far as trigger points goes, there was a lot of things where we wanted to be able to be in between the two musical states. Like a good example is going from the plaza and sort of descending down into the field. There's a sort of abstract version of the piece and then a more concrete version of the piece that you're sort of blending between. And we didn't want that to happen too immediately. We want it to be sort of gradual, so there's multiple points in which it's almost like I think of a lot as a crossfader, just because used to DJ and do a lot of mixing. So you're sort of having a crossfader that's between the A point and the B point. You don't want it to just slide all the way over to the B point. You want it to be more gradual. So there's different spaces in between where you're sort of getting 80% of one layer and 20% of another, or 60% of one layer and 40% of another, until you're all the way 100% to the other direction.
And turns out the easy way to do this, because at first in the mock-up it was just spheres in Unreal, but it was hard to tempo sync correctly and stuff, and it didn't really need it to be in 3D. So the way we did it is you have an RTPC between the two songs, and it's totally a crossfade. So you have very dozens of triggers on your path. So each time you cross a trigger, it slowly fades the RTPC, so it gives out exactly the result that Spencer was looking for.
Yeah, I mean, I made the original mock-ups for this just in Unreal, just by placing sort of spheres as audio emitters, not as, like a 2D procedural sort of thing in Wise. So like a lot of what the Nicola was trying to do was basically just recreate my really kind of ham-fisted DIY way of trying to throw this idea together. All of this gets really tricky when it comes time to put out the soundtrack album, because take a very living, very 3D, very spatialized musical experience and just bounce it down to stereo, 2 tracks, fixed time, replayable on an LP. So that was like a very long process for me, was sort of creating this idealized version of that shift between the two environments.
Yeah, I mean, essentially what you're saying is the game's soundtrack writes itself when you're playing the game, but the game soundtrack outside of the game needs to be performed as if you were playing the game.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the use of the recorder also made it so that the music had to go in a certain aesthetic, because each time you get the recorder out, the music fades out. So you do need to be able to like have those continuous music pads and stuff, but not be like too intense or anything.
Someone carved notches in the bamboo for the wind to flit through, so it can sing.
Yeah. Well, and again, back to this idea that you press play on the soundtrack, and I think naturally you listen until it stops.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in the game, you have locomotion, you have movement at any point during that composition. At any point along that path, you could stop. You can stop moving,
Right.
and the music doesn't stop with you. It needs to continue, and it needs to continue at that at the place where it is, right? And I guess in jazz they might call it vamp. It needs to vamp in that state while you're there. Whether you've got your recorder out and are capturing some wind, or whether you just decided to, get off your bike and take in the view.